This is the E of real estate. My name is Rene Stevens. I'm your host, and today I have James Boekbinder as our guest. James is an expert in user behavior. He advises clients on multinational content strategy, cross-cultural communication, and interaction design. He's an advocate that the shape of a successful product is hidden inside human behavior. James advises organizations preparing for innovation of their product and service systems. When the web emerged as a mass medium, he helped pioneer some of the first online workspaces, content management systems, and also editorial strategies for real-time global publishing. He played a leading role in the creation of highly successful products and services for clients, including the United Nations Development Program, actionable, the City of Amsterdam, the Netherlands Council for Health and Society, and the Knowledge Center for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. For several years now, James has also been engaged as a design researcher and user experience expert in urban design, mainly related to transportation. Welcome, James. Quite a list.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I feel honored.
Yeah, you have been teaching about all these matters at a couple of universities now for about, I believe, 12 years.
That's correct,
and yes, and that makes you even a more interesting guest for this podcast, the E of real estate. Because as we both know that the learning environment has a huge impact on people who are using that learning environment, students and staff. And I want to explore today with you your perspective about how the learning environment can improve the core business of the university, so learning and research, but also health and well-being of the users. And then health in a very broad way, not just physical health and security, but also mental and emotional. Being a well-skilled professional in user behavior and designing digital interfaces and urban interaction design in the physical environment, and even social interactions in the form of service design. How do you feel when experiencing as a professor the usability of university campuses? Can you give an example that made you sad and also that made you very excited?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, I've been mainly, to give it some context, I have been lecturing in digital design and service design related courses and methods, mainly at universities of applied sciences. I lectured for about 10 years in Rotterdam at the University of Applied Science, and I'm going on my second year now of lecturing at the Amsterdam University of Applied Science. And I've also had some occasion as a professional to inhabit other campuses in the United Kingdom and in America, the United States to some degree. So this is the background of my experiences. Oh, and I should mention I'm also teaching at master level on a smaller scale at a couple of universities. So your question was, how do I experience it? So my experiences are very much derived from those experiences, just to make it clear that I'm not attempting to generalize too broadly. However, having said that, I do think that as a person who has worked in big organizations and with big systems and services, and who has contact with other lecturers and professors and students, some of my experience I do think is fairly broadly generalizable. So to answer your question, what is something that made me unhappy? I think that was the first question.
Yes, correct.
Well, I must say that in my experience, universities that I've taught at and many others I suspect suffer from a lot of pathologies caused by top-level strategic and business decisions, which filter down and metastasize throughout the entire organization. And as a lecturer, you are continually battling systemic problems, or the kind of symptoms, the effects of systemic problems, which are not something you can influence. You can live with it or not live with it. You can sometimes oppose them. So there were several things that make me, and not only me, unhappy. It's not an accident that there's such a high turnover in certain universities among the staff. One of the things is, well, to give you an example of a problem, the fact that for many universities, I'm putting it very bluntly here, I don't mean to paint everyone with a broad brush, but there are often financial incentives to let as many students as possible come in and to make as many as possible graduate. And there are also situations I've seen where a certain population is seen as a cash cow. And as a lecturer, even if no one tells you explicitly, you know through experience and through the way it's set up that if you insist on a basic quality standard of work of the students, you will pay a terrible price. For example, in some of my work, rules were made without consulting me that gave students as many as 4 different opportunities to redo an assignment. So that means a failing student will take potentially 4 times the workload of a normal student. Admission requirements were literally removed in one case, so you didn't have to go through any kind of selection. All this was replaced with a kind of a flimsy advisory conversation at the beginning, right? So basically, everybody can come in. But the norms, the amount of students who were expected to pass or fail, remained the same. So in other words, I've now got as a lecturer in first year, maybe as many as 30%, or in some freak cases, as many as 90% of the students who basically should not be there for one reason and another. And if I fail those students, if I give them a failing grade, I will then have 4 times the workload of a teacher who finds some way to pass them. Now, in this situation, what you see is all kinds of strange approaches, ways of making sure more students get a passing grade. For example, team assignments suddenly become very popular. And this is then backed up with a whole ideology about why that's a 21st century skill, why now multidisciplinary work is the most important, why we have to have certainly leave behind this ancient, obsolete system with some lecturer in front of a class sending things in one direction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's always research that can be trotted out, cherry-picked to support this. The real reason is that it's just easier to take 3 students who aren't performing, 2 who are, put them in a team. The 2 who are realize if they want their grade, they have to do the work of the other 3. The other 3 do nothing, and all of them get a passing grade. Now, the teacher is happy because they're out of my life. The school is happy because the statistics, which are used to determine success and failure, in other words, things like the dropout rate or the failure rate, these norms, which were established actually without taking this situation into account, they are then respected and everything looks fine. But as a teacher, as a lecturer, of course, you know that this grading is not accurate. Now that raises all kinds of questions, as you can imagine. So this was one thing I was very unhappy with, was because, of course, I'm getting complaints continually from the students who are doing their work, and they don't understand why someone who, I'm giving you a real example now, who physically doesn't show up in the school gets the same grade they do.
Mm-hmm.
So
that
so I don't to push this too hard, because I want to very quickly, I hear myself saying this, and the danger is that if you try to talk about these things as a lecturer, that you always sound like somebody whose hair is on fire, and people turn off and think this guy is just kind of out of control. He's talking, he's giving extreme anecdotic examples. But since you asked for an example of something that made me unhappy, that was one thing. And the point is, for all kinds of systemic reasons, you cannot really, we'll put it this way, opposing that is going to have a very high cost for any lecturer.
that when I subdivide the learning environment in three main categories, the physical part and the digital part and the social part. So what you are now addressing is mainly the latest one, the social part. And I agree fully with you. That's the most important one because it's all about people. And even the best physical and digital integration of a campus, university campus, cannot solve that issue.
That has been my experience too.
Yeah. And could you give a very inspiring feeling you got when about the physical and the digital environment of a university? Because you are a designer in these things, human behavior, and then you said, "Wow, this place, this is really working like it should be."
Well, I can give one example from the University of Applied Science. The second one I'm teaching at was the fact that when I walked in, I saw a very clearly defined, beautifully designed and expressed house style with physical elements that distinguished it immediately from all the other faculties, and which seemed to me to have been very well designed to fit the mindset of the students, the type of work. You know, there were, for example, there were big magnetic, this whole kind of icon set, which was expressed not only in print, but also as big magnetic symbols you could stick to a door, and which allowed teachers and also the students to play and make a kind of totem-like compositions. So it invited play, and I thought that was very good. It also indicated that at some level in this organization, somebody found it worthwhile to create a dedicated, appropriate place for this kind of design learning. So that already gives me a signal that basically somebody gave a damn at a higher level. And that is something which I immediately experienced as a difference. And having a dedicated place when you teach design, even despite all of the hype about distance learning and whatever, having a place to get human beings together and do a certain kind of studio work is just extremely important. So that made me happy. Listen, can I say something about the connection between what you call the social, the world of the rules and the strategy and the interactions, and the digital and physical?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Here's the thing, and this is what I have a sharp eye for as a designer of such systems. What you often have is when there is dysfunction, when there's something wrong, as an example I just gave. What happens is the facility managers or the designers of the digital and physical part are approached to solve these problems.
Mm-hmm.
And usually they are presented with the wrong problem or the problem framed wrongly, or a problem which they shouldn't be solving at all and which they by definition can't solve. So for example, as I was saying, you know, if the teams become the norm, teamwork becomes the norm from the very first day, what might happen, for example, is that the intranet or working environment, the information environment, the learning management system, is then seen as inadequate because it doesn't have a lot of specific functionalities for tracking teams. So a company will be approached and they'll make some sort of elaborate application or sub-application. In this way, I see a lot of failure and wasted money. And I often think that the design companies and facility managers have to ask themselves, what's the right problem to solve here? And do I want to do this? Because, you know, we both know if you are to any degree ethical and genuinely have a client who, you know, want to help or make something that makes it work better, then you're going to ask some critical questions about this. You know, for example, suppose I'm giving a hypothetical example now, where you make a whole new intranet that allows intense tracking of teams. Now, this is a very rich environment with a lot of different work in it, and it imposes a lot of different tasks. The last thing people in that organization want is transparency, because the lack of transparency enables them to survive this twisted system. They don't want to track every single interaction with the students. The last thing they want is the accreditation committee or inspectors looking over their shoulder and saying, wait a minute, you know, this student seems to have not turned in work in 3 weeks, and that one turns in twice the work of the other 3, and they don't want all that. So the thing about it is, the design research you have to do when someone presents you with a problem, either as a company or facility manager, is to find out what's really going on here. And that's incredibly difficult because people have an interest in an organization which has organizational problems. They have an interest in hiding it or not being open about it. So that's one thing I can say. As far as the physical environment, it's often actually not rocket science. And the physical environment is often, I've come to experience it rather as something that is abused regularly, beaten up on. So, for example, I read in a recent research report that, you know, this business of standing in front of a class with people in these theatrical rows listening to you, that's the old world, it's bad, throw it away. This is, of course, utter nonsense. The conducting a critical, analytical session, a discussion with a group of students in that situation works perfectly fine if everyone knows what they're doing. Other situations demand, for example, indeed, a studio type environment with people sitting at tables and somebody walking around. I could be wrong, but that seems to me like a problem which any intelligent 5-year-old could solve by simply pushing some tables together and then pushing them back apart and rearranging them. It should not be the subject of vast conclusions about what is obsolete or not and how what you know, new learning is or isn't. All these things a professional teacher can solve in 2 seconds if you let them. But of course, you know, you have to have the right decisions there. And, you know, the worst thing you can have is once people have cobbled together a space they can work with, coming in and redesigning it according to these kinds of principles. You know, and so these are pitfalls I wanted to mention because, you know, a big danger I see is that as facility managers and designers, we are kind of misused to solve problems or pretend to be solving them that we really can't, and messing up the facilities in the process.
Yeah, actually you are pinpointing now that the whole learning environment is of course a very complex system. And to solve or to improve that system, it is not just one point or another point. You have to see it as a whole to approach it. And so the learning environment, as I said, is not only physical but also digital, but mainly social. And could you mention some do's and do nots about creating such a system and or reshaping it or improving it?
Yeah.
From your perspective as a professional designer in human behavior interfaces, but also as a professor, as a user of that.
Yeah. Well, I think the very first principle is, first of all, do design research. Go in there. Don't believe only quantitative results or research. That can tell you a number of truths or facts, but it doesn't tell you the why. It doesn't give you the big, deep insights behind it. The second thing is, so in other words, what I'm saying is go in there and do real design research. I'm talking about things like observing, mystery shopping, contextual inquiry in which you follow people around at that place and you find out what it's really like. Mystery shopping in the sense of, you know, actually trying to participate in the systems of the place or following people as they try to participate. So the second thing I would say about that is, if you really want to find out what's going on, you have to pick the right methods. And the right methods are not to have friendly conversations with committees of people who work there, because they simply aren't either free to tell you the whole truth of what's going on. There are too many taboo topics often, or you just don't have the time to really win their trust, or perhaps they're just so used to the place that they've quit seeing 99% of it out of habit. So for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily the dysfunction of an organization, but for all kinds of reasons, they basically can't tell you what's going on. So I guess my first principle would be pick design research, which will give you a chance to find out what's really going on there. Is the communication bad, for example, because the technical system just doesn't allow people to send and organize messages? Or is it bad because people refuse any discipline in their communication?
Yeah.
Or is there some other reason? To give you an example. So that would be my first, I guess my first principle of how to tackle it. The second would be to conduct discussions about with the client or the people who, in this case, I'm imagining while you talk that a university faculty or perhaps the whole university has approached a design company or a person like me with a problem they want to solve, whether it's communication or the learning management system or the learning environment, to conduct a discussion about how to frame the problem and which problems can actually be solved. You know, going back to my first point, not to, you know, keep this in some sort of a negative light. A lot of things are possible, but one of the most difficult discussions I find is focusing realistically on what is possible to improve and making some kind of a decision about that. Because, you know, often people, for all sorts of reasons, just have either vague or exaggerated or unclear ideas about what improvement means, getting it concrete. So, you know, that can be as simple as just, well, you know, if I think about something like the team assignments I was talking about, if I go back in my mind, there's no way that that school or those teachers are going to change that. So, you know, discussing ways of making the teams work better and facilities, you know, those teams won't work better because they should never have existed in the first place. Mm. And that is just a kind of a fact, and you have to kind of attempt, at least, I think, as a design professional, to talk about that, to talk about what is really the goal of the possibility here. So I guess that would be the second one, is a strategic discussion about what's really possible. Mm-hmm. And I think from that point on, you know, my advice would be to analyze your research and, you know, to do everything you can to gradually prototype and iteratively design in such a way that you get the errors and the difficulties out of the system, that you don't try to build it and then install it and then hope it works, because it's too complex for that. So I guess that would be three I could name off the top of my head.
Yeah. I can imagine that that a real estate manager or a facility manager, or maybe even somebody from the board of a university who hears this, says, no, we have just this problem, and please solve only this one, and don't try to solve our whole organizational structure. But we know it's a system, so it affects all. So you have to make clear what is the system all about, and what could be the possible impact or the restraints from the system on. Is it solvable? Like you were saying, is it solvable? What would you say to such a person that says, no, James, nice, but I only need this small of advice and not the big picture?
Well, I think I would have a couple of standard responses to that.
First share with us.
Okay, the first one would be, if I was not in agreement with that. I mean, it would really depend, huh? I guess the first one would be to try to explain what I think the consequences will be of taking that advice. So if I do what you say you want me to do, honestly, I think that the following things will happen. This will be the bad things, that will be possibly good things. So I would try to honestly give them my perspective about what the consequences are of that. And if they then insisted and said, no, 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 you know, we're certain this is the right thing to do, I might go ahead and just do it, having warned them, and try to keep an open mind. And I might try to tell them, well, look, you know, we should at least monitor this in some way.
Yes.
If I had the, and that would be because I had the feeling that this was a client who could genuinely be helped. And often you also don't want to be too stubborn about your own expertise. I mean, these are people, this makes the work rather difficult because you mentioned a facility manager or somebody. This is a person who knows that business better than me.
Yes.
And who may know things I don't know, and who at some level, I don't want to get too stubborn with. I have to learn what it looks like through their eyes. So here I've arrived at something I should have said first. First of all, I think in that conversation, I would try to find out why they are so certain of this. What is it that they know? What can help me understand what their world looks like? So that's two things. The third thing I might say is if I thought that that person was genuinely mistaken, and for whatever reason, I think I might say, I can't afford to help you with this because I really honestly think there's a great big chance of failure here. And I cannot afford to have a failure of this scale on my record. I just don't risk it.
Probably that will wake them up when you say something like that. They say, oh, tell me.
Well, you know, I've been in this business nearly 30 years now, my God. And, you know, I've seen a lot of failure. And often the risks I'm identifying come out of very solid professional practice. I mean, this is about human beings. You know, in any big product service system, especially something like a university campus, you're talking about people and whole lives that are being carried on in this place. And, you know, you cannot solve problems inside the psychology, the organizational structure, or the way people interact, or their culture, merely by changing technologies. You can impact with changing technologies and facilities. But, you know, you're talking about people, in other words. So that's way too complex to make simplistic solutions for. I guess the final thing I would say about that conversation was, you know, if I had I think I would try to make clear to them as well, if I thought they were sincere at any rate, look, there are a lot of companies that will take your money and be happy to give you what you say you want, and you're responsible if it doesn't work, not them. They did what you wanted. So, you know, I'm not that specialist. There's a reason why I'm having this conversation, and I'm not in that section. There's nothing wrong with that in principle. I mean, I know a lot of big companies, but, you know, they say, look, it's not our responsibility. You know, they say they know their business. They say they know what they want. They want an intensive application that allows a teacher to track 20 teams at once with 50 different screens. Well, fine, give it to them. That's one way to do it, but that's not generally the way I do it.
When we approach it from the other side, so we have now talked about top down from the big system, and we knowing that everything should be integrated. But when you say, okay, it's too difficult to start from that strategic level in the whole system, could you give could you share some experiences in how you can use, for instance, nudging, that you say, okay, I'm going to prepare the physical environment and or the digital environment to nudge, to invoke them to certain behavior, to enable certain behavior. And then from there, maybe you can build on.
This is great that you asked this, because that's really something I forgot in my answer is, in my experience, people who are focused on big problems or big picture problems often have lost sight of all of the different things that are actually working well and which present opportunities. So I think that would also definitely be in my conversation, in my research, would be to find out what works here. You know, a recent example I saw, I'm trying not to name names in this discussion because I don't want to, you know, misrepresent anyone, but in a recent example on a university campus, the perception was that the kind of interdisciplinary work and exchange that they had, that strategically had been established as a goal, was not really happening. But when I examined it, I found that there's actually some very successful student-owned, practically, programs of interdisciplinary work, which are highly successful. But amid the massive programs and massive activities, they're not really noticeable. And when I see that amid, hundreds of other programs, I see that one and I think, that's the tip of a potential iceberg. I mean, that's beginning to work. What we have to do is find out. I hope I'm answering your question with this. I would tell them,
you do.
I found something here which actually works very well, which seems to be solving a problem you say you have. Let's find out why it works so well.
Yeah.
And let's then see if we can extract principles from that. And the second part of my suggestion would be, for God's sake, start with piloting things which are low risk and potentially high gain, high result. It's a bit like gambling. I mean, in this kind of complex situation, I'm reminded of a presentation I saw by Nassim Taleb about what he calls statistical fat tails, where you just take out options, as it were. This guy was a trader. You take out options, and one of them hits. But you've got to make sure that you've made an intelligent selection of potential options in the form of little pilot projects. So for God's sake, find out ways of trying things which don't challenge the whole system or require whole political discussions to be made.
Exactly.
And It's funny, in all the years I've been working, most of the time we can find them.
Yeah.
It's not like it's an impossible dream or something.
Yeah. So when I heard correctly what you said, find things that are already working and that are adding to the strategic goals or the well-being and health of the users, and enhance them, give them some more support and bring them more into the daylight, and so that they can grow better or more than they are already doing. And by doing so, you get results, probably, because there are already results that will be bigger, and that will convince people, okay, we have to add more in that direction. And the other one I hear you saying is, try out, do things that are low risk, as you said, and there are so many programs that start in a university. Why not use this one in the physical space, or this one in the digital space, or even in the interface between those two? So that is also a whole other area. So you can, I only focus on physical, I only focusing on the digital learning environment, but there's also an interaction where those two meet. Can you say something about that interaction? So where physical and digital meet, so obviously you're sitting somewhere and there's Wi-Fi, so there's an interaction. But for instance, another thing could be that digital is helping you to navigate through the building to find whatever you have to find.
Well, let me give an example from professional practice. A couple of years ago, I was hired by a very interesting foundation that arranges special language and writing lessons by real children's writers in schools where the children have, for whatever reason, weaknesses in the area of language. They may be immigrant children, or they may just not have a big program with writing, or, and this has been a highly successful program. And you have to imagine that they're sending writers into schools who then work directly with these children. So this is a very hands-on way of doing things. And I was approached because they had gotten some funding to try and make the jump into the digital realm, to see whether they could make some kind of an offer of the program in the digital realm. So not always with physical teacher or physical writers working in physical schools in that way. That was the problem. And one moment I remember is when I was looking, I did a lot of design research. I'm a very small guy, so elementary school furniture fits me. And I can sit in it for hours just watching students, watching teachers, watching the writers work. Before I go on with this example, I must say I have rarely seen something more impressive than those writers. The incredible magic of the way they work with the kids and what the kids achieve, and the many different kinds of learning going on. I mean, it was really amazing. I had a binder full of learnings and notes and interesting mental and didactic models that I emerged with from this research. Anyway, to answer your question about the connection between the digital and physical, thinking about ways in which the powerful interaction between writer and child could be exported in some way to the digital space, I began looking around for ways of doing what I just said, creating prototypes, creating some experiment. And looking across this organization's activities in that way, I suddenly saw that they do special campaigns once or twice a year where, a big financial institution or somebody wants to sponsor them. So they'll say, look, we're going to have a week-long, campaign where you go to all these elementary schools and we send some volunteers from the bank and we pay for some stuff. And I noticed that in one of these campaigns, they were using a lot of video. And immediately I realized this is a laboratory to find out whether the bond that emerges between a child and a real children's writer to some degree can be created through something like video, through digital means. They're basically in the room, they're using the video. We can set up this, without changing anything, we can just go in with a research script and we can start to learn what the impact is of these different digital things. We can add a few before and after surveys with the volunteers and teachers. It's already paid for, doesn't cost you anything. And, in that way, we were able to just take something that's existing, but by seeing it as a prototype, add a few things to it. And my suggestion then was, without paying an extra penny, except for a little bit of analysis, you've already got a laboratory here that will tell you something essential about the limitations and possibilities of video as opposed to a live person in the room. And which will also tell you something about how much the people who are volunteering can do without the writer present. So there were a couple of different learnings we could extract from this. So I hope this is beginning to answer your question. It's a question of having a mindset of seeing the whole system, all of its facets, in new ways. So it would have been very easy to say, no, I'm not interested in your publicity campaigns. That's not part of my job. Listen, if it's part of that system, it's part of my job. And I want to know what's going on there. And, the prototyping mindset, the mindset of exploratory research is what enables me and other professionals to see those kind of opportunities. So as you're saying, it could be as easy as, if you see people using a space or facility in a certain way, it can also be finding out where people are experimenting and solving problems on their own. One of the things I've often done is just collect all the little solutions people make and study them. Have you ever noticed that in every modern office, there's one nerd who can use Excel for anything from the moon landing to, the organizing the public buses? There's always one who's a sort of an Excel master. And usually what you'll find is that person has put together some dedicated tools for managing things, and everyone's using them. I often collect those things. In city administrations, I've collected those things.
Yeah, that brings to my mind that indeed there are always hacks around the system, because people are experiencing that the system is the system, beat the system. You hear so often. It would be really a great idea to collect those hacks and see if they really improve. Probably they do, otherwise they would be not in place anymore. And find several of them and prototype them and make them stronger and bigger, or introduce them somewhere else. Say, okay, it's working there, but maybe let us give it a try. Maybe it will also work for you.
That I can tell you that I have seen so many. I have used those hacks, as you call them, so often as the basis of new functionalities, new ways of doing things, but also ways of making me understand how these tasks and activities look to the people doing them. You know, for example, if I see a whole binder full of notes about tasks that were done with students, I can read those notes and I can see what that person is struggling with. What did they find worth writing down? What was the thing they were scared of forgetting? You know, it's really like being an anthropologist going in there into the jungle of the organization and, you know, sorting out what people are doing in there, which is what makes the work very exciting and interesting as well.
When I try to combine, so the first part of the interview and what we are at now, that we started with big systems and yeah, it should be so nice when you can redesign it from scratch. But yeah, that is not that realistic, as we both know. But yeah, at least we have to make them aware that there are some things that are not working that good as it could be, although probably they will be aware of that for any reason or the other reason. They're not changing it. But to start with the hacking, that those people know their organization as the best. We as external advisors never are going to understand the level that they do because they are in the system, they're part of the system. And they found their hacks to work around things, to make their work easier or to feel more happier or whatever. And that brings me to the point that you are using your expertise also to create innovations in organizations and in products and in services. How could what could be a possibility to innovate on a small, low-risk scale in a university environment, in a learning environment?
You know,
to improve the core business, learning and research, and on the other hand, also to improve the experience of the users.
Well, yeah, that's a difficult question to answer in a general way, because, you know, in each university, despite having some of the same pathologies, the actual activities they're doing, the courses they're teaching, the nature of the learning that's going on can be very different. And so what might be I'm just trying to think of a good way to answer this, that what might be a low risk way of prototyping your way forward in those situations. I guess I would start by saying, which risks do you have to mitigate? For example, if something is politically very sensitive, you know, I mean, if I go in talking like I'm talking to you now about just what an utterly bad idea it is to do all this teamwork with first-year students, you know.
Yeah.
If I talk about that, I will be thrown out of the building. That will be the end of my lecturing and designing career.
Yeah.
So there are things that might be politically too sensitive. There might be a legacy of failure to innovate. They may have tried certain things in the past and have gotten allergic to them. I can tell you that there was a time when I avoided mentioning user-centered design because the companies had burned their fingers on expensive personas and scenarios and systems. And the result was that they were all laying around in a kind of a cemetery on a shelf. And the intelligent and extremely experienced designers had solved it anyway after 2 days without those things. So, you know, there may be a legacy of failure there. There may just be a massive amount of things that are risky to change. Think about healthcare. You know, that's really the poster child for risk and complexity. So I would try to find out what the risks were that we were running. And then I would look around in my design research. I might even actually incorporate into my design research program ways of finding where we can get around those risks. So for example, I might avoid any kind of prototyping with high profile programs which are going to become a political firefight. I'll never forget one case, and here I'm really not going to name names, but let me tell you, it was a very large organization, a government organization. I won't go further than that. And, you know, we prototyped a thing that was going to make certain administrative processes easier. I had sort of done a classic bottom-up examination. I had sat next to clerks doing their work. We had prototyped this thing. And unbeknownst to us, a consulting agency had been carefully going through a very rather old-fashioned optimization program for these people, and the sort of thing where they, you know, shave a few paper clips off of here and a few more paper off of there. And then we showed up with this thing, and a firefight broke out. And, you know, the result was that another department won the fight, and the project was shelved, and people were all thrown out. And one of them became a successful entrepreneur with some of the stuff we created. But, you know, so I might try to avoid, if the risk is that it's a politically sensitive, you know, thing, I might try to avoid that by just picking a very uncontroversial area to play with. I might also look for kinds of facility. If you're talking about facilities, the physical supports that a learning environment needs, and if you're talking about you know, the information environment as well, which we should include in that, because that's now so big, it's like an environment people navigate. You know, it's no longer kind of a supporting element in a physical environment.
True.
You know, if you're talking about that, I might again try to look, you know, the risks there might be things like people are simply overloaded now and exhausted and cognitively so burdened that you can't really introduce a new thing and expect people in an organic way to use it. So to mitigate that risk, I might actually try to allocate some money to a small group of users and just in a dedicated way say, guys, you install this, you try this for a week, it's an experiment, you'll be paid a little bit, but, you know, with you 10 people, we're going to try this.
Yes.
So I find often that companies and institutions treat their system as though it was the free market and people were consumers. That's another big pitfall. You know, that you have to really be careful of that. I mean, students and teachers and support staff and everything that goes on in the university are not consumers in that sense. They don't have the choices.
Exactly. They are employed, or they follow a education, and
yeah. So I mean, they're not going to, you know, put it. I say that, but you know, if you think about something like the system with which you record the grades or manage important documentation, there you have no choice at all. But you know, what you see is that if you have something like an intranet or a working environment, and it doesn't really work, what you see is people pulling out their iPad and using Google Forms and Google Docs and using privately bought services, or not even bought, but provided services, and creating this parallel world in which they're doing all this stuff, which you actually shouldn't be doing, especially now with the privacy laws sharpening. But people have to get their work done, and they've gotten used to some of the best online products like the Google Suite, the G Suite, and so, you know, they start using it. So I'm trying not to talk too much now, and you can see how difficult it is. But if I go back to your original point, so what are low risk ways of doing this? Well, if the risk is people are overloaded and don't have choices, create some small artificial environment with a new program and try it out. Just pilot it in classic way. If the risks are political, avoid them. Find something that's less politically controversial. If the risks are associated with resources, with money, then have some tough conversations, because people want to believe something's always possible. It isn't. You know, there may have to be a room or two set up with new equipment in a certain way, or students may have to be provided with some new application or way of doing things. I think the other element here that's really important is time. You know, to think of this in terms of projects. I mean, you need finish lines, you need milestones. I'm actually pretty old-fashioned in the way I set up projects. When people start being too agile, I get nervous. I've seen too many clubs of nerds run off with the project, leaving everyone else scratching their head. I think in terms of kind of old-fashioned Gantt charts with milestones and, you know, is this done and can we use this now? Will it crash if I drive it? You know, having said that though, with something like a university campus or any big complex system, we have to understand that it is both succeeding and failing simultaneously, always. And I think the right way to think about it is you can move the whole system forward in some good way, but we shouldn't think about making a permanent improvement or redesigning it in some new shape in that sense.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we've got edition 2.0, come back in a year.
Yes.
I don't think it's like that.
Yeah.
So I think that quite often you wind up talking, whether you like it or not, for example, about the roles people are playing and the responsibilities they have.
Yeah.
As well as the new thing you've created, like an application or a new kind of a studio space, just to give an example.
Yeah.
Then you have to talk about what people are going to do about it or with it.
Yeah. Actually, that I think that we are coming to a point where we can summarize that when you really want to improve a learning environment consisting of physical, digital, and social, you should get involvement of people, engagement. And not only from the people on the working floor, but also in the top level management. And for that, you have to pick the projects or the prototype you're going to do wisely, because you want that it starts and that they can create an experience with that. And probably when it works well for them, according to them, it will grow anyway. I would like to ask you a question, a personal question. Can you mention us a aha moment you had in your career, your long career, that really changed you on a personal level?
You know, I would like to mention a moment which happened in the course of no more than about 12 weeks. That was my teacher training. When I had already become a university lecturer, like most design professionals, I was recruited for my professional knowledge. I had never taught professionally. I didn't know the first thing about it. Like most people who are like the idea of teaching and who are professional, I had the illusion that I was probably pretty good at it. Of course I wasn't. And the teacher training, which was actually very good, it was a 300-hour intensive course taught by trainers who were PhDs and master level in educational science. It was very fundamental. I mean, it just took the basics, which have been established pretty well through the years. You know, things like basics of group dynamics, how to construct a test, seemingly age-old things like Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives, you name it. You know, there's a few names you always get. And for me, that was a real revelation in two ways. First of all, realizing that a learning environment and learning poses totally different requirements, often counterintuitive ones, to the things that people usually think work. So for example, people think an exciting, entertaining presentation is teaching people more. Often it's not. Often you're burning up the battery power in their brains with a lot of elaborate visuals, and often they'll be wildly enthusiastic, but you test them, and then you find out they only remember a couple of colorful stories you told, and they can't remember even the subject.
Yeah.
So
goes that also for the physical environment? Because you can also get too much impulses.
Absolutely. The physical environment, you know, God help you if it's too interesting. You know, learning is a question of focusing people's minds so strongly in various ways on one or two things that they then experience what's known as far transfer. In other words, transfer to long-term memory. They can, after a couple months, they can retrieve them, they can work with them. And it is incredibly difficult to do. I always compared it to being a combination of a stage magician and a clinical psychologist. You're keeping the balls in the air and pulling the rabbits out of the hat. At the same time, you're engaging individual people in various activities, and they have to all be focused like you know, incredibly closely on only the thing you're teaching them. All the rest has to be excluded. And yeah, if you have interesting, you know, extra stimuli there, they're all taking attention, they're all taking processing power. So, you know, and this is doubly true of any kind of audiovisual or computer-based media. That's where you really see the mistake, where, you know, beautiful videos are shown of animals in Africa or whatever, but when you actually test those kids, they can't remember this stuff. Whereas a very old-fashioned presentation with a few simple diagrams and an engaging activity, they remember it. So, you know, this business of a learning environment, the goals you have are very specific and often cause you to make choices which seem counterintuitive to people outside of it. That's one. The other big aha, besides the fact that I found out that it worked very differently than I thought, the other big aha moment was just the incredible amount of bullshit which has seeped into educational faculties around the world and spread virally, and which is almost impossible to stamp out. I mean, it's really an epidemic, you know, whether it's all kinds of crap about learning styles or, you know, the, you know, problem-based learning or whatever it is, you know, well, I shouldn't say problem-based learning, that's a valid thing, but you know, there's just an incredible amount of bad science, which once it got into the bloodstream is still in there. And when I learned the right way to think about this, when I really began reading the research, I realized that there are certain things that are just outright wrong and which have become big hypes and which are messing up physical, digital, and social interactions at every level. I think the one I would always mention, which by the way will often get me thrown out of the room, is learning styles. They have been debunked and debunked and debunked and debunked. It's an illusion, but it's still being taught in pedagogical academies. People still have the illusion they see them. They still have the wrong idea of what it means. They even have the wrong idea of the model, the most common model they're based on. So that was a big aha moment for me, because after that I began changing the way I taught, orchestrating things very precisely, reducing the amount I said and did only to the essential thing, and designing both the space and the materials in such a way that it created this lightning focus on only the thing that's being learned. And I can tell you that the impact was enormous. I mean, the progress made by those students was really great to see, you know, so that's an aha moment for me, was becoming a professional teacher who understood how it worked.
Thank you very much for sharing these aha moments. That gave me an aha moment right now, that actually I think we should more focusing on taking things away than to add new things, because there are so many trends and hypes and you name it that is tried out, and even when it's not working, as you said, it will still remains in the bloodstream for a long period of time. So the focus should maybe be more, suppose we take something away, what is going to happen?
Yes.
Maybe nobody's missing it, or add or change one thing for just one hack that somebody invented, and see what happens when you give them the space to really officially use that hack.
Well, yeah,
worthwhile for trying out.
Yes, definitely. It's really good that you say that, because, you know, this is something which it didn't occur to me to mention, but in fact, it has been, in terms of learning design, of actually designing the materials and the activities, it has been one of my great rants through the years, is, you know, you only need the few things you really need. And the rest is all either through wrong ideas or insecurity or its legacy that you just inherited. I think that's a very important point, is that you can tell people, why don't we just take something away and see how it works? Of course, it's very controversial, because often the things you start talking about taking away are things people are committed to, or often they're also people. And that gets pretty tough. One of the difficult things is to say, you know, and it's for me or any lecturer or anyone, is to be told, we think you maybe, it's better to not have you involved here. You know, I mean, for good and bad reasons. One of the the things that I talk about a lot with colleagues is this whole emergence of coaching as a kind of a way of sort of ensuring some kind of success among students and teams and whatnot. I mean, I think that if, you know, that might be something which I know my colleagues wouldn't like me to say this, but, you know, if I look at the amount of energy going into so-called coaching by people who are not psychologists, not specialists in learning, not specialists in the subjects, but are somehow moderators of all this, I've seen it end in disaster. I mean, I've seen it just waste energy and time. And I think, you know, get rid of all that help and they'll do much better. And
yeah, I think
here,
that
I'm getting to get a little too controversial, I think. You know,
yeah.
if you talk about getting rid of things, you know, I guess it connects to me that just association here. When you say that, what I see in my mind is a group of enthusiastic learners and perhaps helpers or lecturers, or maybe coaches as well, who are working in very bare bones situations, but who own everything there.
Exactly.
Who control and own everything there, and everything is there for only the reason it should be.
Yeah.
And what you see is people falling in love with some of the seemingly most bland and ugly environments where they're just free,
yeah,
you know, to do what they know they have to do. So, I mean, I do think you make a very important point there, in other words.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point, that it's all about engagement. And that does not mean that you have that you need the most fancy environment, digital or physical, but that people have to own that space and that they have a certain amount of freedom to do their things in the way they want to do it. Of course, the result has to be there at the end. And that brings me to a summary that we started off with, the notion that a system is very complex. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. So when we speak about learning environment, that is not the sum of physical, digital, and social. It is more than that. And we ended saying that it's also a famous quote in architecture: less is more. So by taking away and focusing on what is really required, and going back to the core, that people want to learn, they want to educate themselves, and that professors want to teach people and want to do their research, and give them a certain amount of freedom. And I had yesterday an interview with a health insurance company, and they have the policy to bring democracy as low as possible into the organization. Actually, that meant that the role of all those managers layers changed very drastically, and a lot of them left the organization for that, because they were not willing or wanted to keep the working the way they always did, the organization for that. But the organization is thriving now, because when you hire somebody, it is a professional. When somebody engaged in a university education, he's very much willing and committed to do that. Why should he otherwise go? And the same goes for professors. They are professionals in their own field, so they are very emotional, involved in what they are doing. Actually, what I heard from several, they are even more involved in the research than in teaching the results to students what they researched.
Yeah. Well, you know, that I'd like to say one more thing if we have time.
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
In connection with that, another thing I think is very important is to beware of a generic approach to service design or problem solving or systemic problem solving. The precise domain and its associated knowledge and expertise is critical. So, you know, another mistake I see being made a lot is people taking over service design methods and applying them almost in a cookie cutter fashion to a hospital, and then a school, and then an insurance company, and then something else. I think it's extremely important as design professionals in it, or facility managers, to acquire the precise, deep theoretical knowledge we need about the environment we're going to try to improve. So in other words, if it's a learning environment, I do not trust people who have not read deeply in the area of learning, the psychology of learning, the organizational aspects of learning.
Yeah.
I do think that that's part of our task. And if we can't acquire that expertise ourselves, we have to have at least enough of it to put someone next to us who has it and engage them in the right way in the project. So, I mean, I think that's something else I would emphasize very strongly about, you know, working in a learning environment as complex as a university. And I personally find the role of facilities, including the digital environment, a very powerful element. You know, I mean, there are certainly ways it can be enabling that we often overlook when we take a too technical view of it.
Exactly. There's another famous quote from Churchill that first we create our environment, and after that it shapes us. Because
Indeed.
there are a lot of constraints, so you can, but you can also look at it as an enabler. And what we said during the several times, even during this interview, that find those things that are work and make them stronger. So make them that they're more enabling the primary process, the core business of a learning environment. So I would like to sum up and thank you very much for your time and for your sharing your expertise and your as a designer, professional, but also as a user of these learning environments, and give us some insights and even some I don't know if I have to say it loud, but the word that came is frustrations, that you know it can be so much better if fill in ... So thank you again for sharing everything, and certainly one or more of our listeners will get inspired and say, well, although it seems to be very difficult, such a complex system as a university environment, but there are very simple, down-to-earth, low-risk possibilities to prototype and just try out. And if it works, it works. So again, thank you so much, James, and we see each other soon again.
Oh, well, thank you very much for asking me. I hope the comments were useful.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.